How do you think public institutions are working to make this technology human-centered?
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me. It's a good question. There's a lot of talk about human-centered AI in the Netherlands, but broader than that in Europe, worldwide. It is, to me, a very unclear term. And also in my daily practice, I've been in the field of AI for nearly 30 years, of which 15 years in the business of AI for social good and public good, trying to motivate and inspire and collaborate with municipalities, with ministries to build AI technology for good, and especially AI technology to enhance equal opportunity in different social domains. And what I see there is that there's a lot of talk about human-centered AI, including people, but it's hardly materialized, especially when it comes to including people who are marginalized or vulnerable. My lab has, which started in 2020 with the long-term strategy of building AI for people and then moving with time to AI with people, creating AI with people, to AI by people. And the transition of my lab, my work from AI for people to AI with people is really a challenge. So to answer your question, there's a lot of talk, but really building AI technology in the public sector for people and with people is still a challenge and still requires a lot of attention, funding, and so forth.
Thank you. I'd like to move to Jacob now. As I mentioned, it is a challenge to build an AI that is truly for the people. And the European Union has been one of the first jurisdictions to try to do that. With the EU AI Act, now we are seeing that the EU is sort of either backpedaling or revising its work with the digital omnibus on AI. Do you think this attempt to amend a legislation that is not fully enforced yet is a sign that the EU no longer believes in its legislative approach to AI? Or is it a sign of confidence in trying to fix one's perceived mistakes?
Thanks for the question. I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about the EU as a monolith in what it's doing with trying to amend some of the already fairly weak legislation in the EU AI Act. But I think it probably reflects, and maybe this is the cynic in me, that it probably reflects a lot of lobby efforts to water down the protections that are already there. I mean, we can already see a good amount of the walkback in the omnibus, in the proposed omnibus, that is trying to cover up a little bit of the already agreed upon transparency laws. And so I think, I think they are being strategic, and there's some writing on the wall of what the US seems to be doing. And perhaps there's a fear that there's going to be that, it's kind of the go-to cliche that regulation is going to stifle innovation, which I don't really agree with. Particularly when you look at what China's doing, which would seem to be point to the opposite. So I think there's some part of me that is cynical and thinks that this is, strong pressure from lobby, but also I think there's a fear that they're going to be taken out of the race because a lot of European firms haven't made a huge push to be in this space, at least compared to, say, some of the US firms.
Thank you, Jacob. I take your point on fear of being left out of the tech race. Anthony, since you are leading a major industrial research hub, What do you make of this narrative about regulation stifling innovation? Do you think that for the industry, especially in emerging technologies like this one, is it better to have clear legal framework, or is it better to sort of go fast and break things?
I think we do need guidelines for sure. I mean, just as a bit of context and background, I mean, Mitsubishi Electric, is operating, as a big electronics manufacturer. We make a lot of physical systems. And a lot of those systems kind of work in spaces where humans are also operating. So we're very interested in, kind of making sure that we can deploy AI into a lot of these systems, but still have like the trustworthiness and safety guarantees. So I do think, some guidelines, regulations are needed, but, they shouldn't be so strict that, they stifle innovation and, not allow us to kind of differentiate against competitors, but still kind of add value to the systems.
Thank you, Anthony. Olaf, your research has focused on geopolitics and macroeconomics of emerging technologies. Do you see AI reshaping global power dynamics and economic competition across economic powerhouses like the US, China, and the EU? And how do you see this European attempt to rejoin the international tech race?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having us. This is a really great question, $60,000 question, as we say in the United States. When we're looking at the cognitive economy, which is what we're calling the AI-driven economy around the world, we're really seeing a structure of the G2 plus X. And the G2 obviously being the United States and China as leading in AI development and scaling, with the X being at the moment undetermined. It's not quite clear yet if that will be Europe. And as somebody who was born and raised in Europe, I would certainly be rooting for Europe, or whether that's going to be India. I think the current effort to readjust the EU AI Act is an effort to get to the X and to be able to unify a market of 500 to 700 million people in order to better compete. If we're very honest, Europe is non-existent when it comes to commercial scalability in AI around the world. That does not mean that there isn't substantial talent, substantial promise, and certainly globally cutting edge R&D and research going on. Quite the opposite. Europe is in the leading tier of research and science and innovation around the world, but it cannot scale. It cannot scale because the market is not unified. It's unified on paper, but not in actuality. When you look at digital services within Europe, European countries assess a quasi-tax of 40% on digital services on each other. That is untenable to entrepreneurs and really to scientists who want to see their solutions scale out. So if Europe wants to play in the G2 plus X world and bring its values to bear, which I would certainly hope that it would, then it needs to pair those values and a reliance on individual dignity, emphasis, I should say, on individual dignity, agency, and individual power with economic scalability. One cannot live without the other. There are other countries that are runners up. I can tell you that, of course, the UAE with the current deals under the Trump administration, Saudi Arabia are ramping up very hard. I am advising the president's office in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a small country by population, but large country by natural resources and geographic area. And they are making very substantial, very rapid efforts, are already in the top 10 of e-government to scale out on AI. Similarly, with, of course, Israel, Malaysia, Finland, etc. So there are runners up that are making stronger efforts than Europe has been to date to compete on a global level. And so I think that balance, both being economically competitive on AI in order to scale out and promulgate its values globally, with savvy regulation is really the name of the game.
Right, and that's it for the tech race. But there is also the digital governance aspect. Pierre, the EU has been very ambitious with the AI Act, the first comprehensive regulation on AI, and it intended to set the international benchmark in this space. Do you think that with this revision, first of all, do you see any given framework emerging on the international level? Could the AI Act still be that framework that sort of sets the regulatory benchmark in terms of international AI governance? Or do you think now the EU has taken a turn that makes that impossible?
Okay, I think that European Union is the leader in AI regulation, but my goal here was to emphasize a broader aspect of AI ethics, because we should not consider AI in isolation, but in my conceptualization of the problem, AI should be replaced in an the contemporary information ecosystem, which is people creating information, feeding the digital memory, and the digital memory being used to train AI. And AI is used to empower people who create new messages, new information, and feed the digital memory. So if we replace AI in the whole information ecosystem, we realize that the ethical question, or that is generally solved by regulation or more regulation, this ethical problem also is related to what people are creating, the information they are feeding the digital memory. And a lot of bad actors knows this very well, because they are creating websites or infiltrating Wikipedia, or using traditional media to inject information in the digital memory. And this information will influence the output of the AI models. So what I wanted to say is that, yes, it is important to regulate the people who create the AI models, but the ethical responsibility bears upon the people who bears also on the people who create the information, and particularly this is in the hands of journalists, professors, researchers, people creating the official websites and so on, because the AI models give a greater weight to this kind of information in the computing of the responses of the AI. So what I am saying here is that the whole AI for people framework should be balanced by AI by people, because we all have a responsibility in the feeding of the digital memory that is training the artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Pierre. Since we are talking about the ethical aspect, I would like to tap on Frincy. You advocate for diversity and inclusion in AI leadership. How can inclusivity be operationalized in AI development and governance?
It's great to be here, and thank you for having me as part of this panel. So it is again, it's an important questions that everybody has been asking since the advent of technology and now in AI as well. Even the representation has been a challenge. When I transitioned from my personal experience, when I transitioned my career into AI, I had struggled to find mentors and people who can actually champion me or help me guide into a career into AI. And since then, as I work in the tech industry, transitioning into leadership or at the decision-making table, it was again becoming harder, especially representation of diversity is more like a checkbox for a lot of organizations. So, through the work at Women in AI, what we are trying to do is to help bring representation by doing several strategies that help women, girls, to adopt or take up educational pathways that can help them get into technical, STEM careers as well as AI careers. So what do? We have several mentorship programs, skills training, educational, and also like scholarships available. And our community is a global community, and again, run by volunteers. And we have inspire, educate, and connect verticals that support girls as well as women in across different stages in their career to enter or accelerate their career in AI. Second is creating visibility and representations. So even though we exist or diverse workforce exist in the industry, they are not visible or recognized enough. So we talk about how do we build role models. So we look up to them and bring more and more role models for them to come and showcase their work and how their diverse perspectives help change real AI applications. Then also building inclusive AI communities. So we have chapters not just globally, we have in countries, in cities, within organizations. So we try to bring people from all these different pockets, from academia, from industry, and bring them together in one stage, and then try to influence the system to create programs or policies that can bring more visibility and also more opportunities to women. So either through corporate partnerships or by advocating for policies that can help the hiring or the promotional leadership training aspects, or providing different skills within the corporate itself. We try to influence the systems to help women come into more leadership roles. And yes, and also we look for what are those real impact that we have witnessed. So over the last 6 years I've been with Women in AI, we have seen a lot of careers transitions, and this has ripple effects as more and more diverse workforce come into AI systems. We will have better AI system. It'll create ripple effects to bring more and more diverse populations back in the career force. Definitely, there are a lot of challenges that still exist. There are still a lot of stereotypes. There are still challenges to really showcase your talents in a minority where you are actually a minority. You have to juggle with childcare, family responsibilities, while making sure that you're also able to advance your career in AI or in any tech. So it is a it there needs to be a lot of support system if we ever want to like achieve that kind of balance in the workforce. We have to provide equal opportunities, at the same time equal support systems, where women specifically can be manage their family, at the same time not lag behind in the career that they want to, they're aspiring for. And also there's a lot of resource limitations. We recently had a lot of backlash in terms of cutting down on diversity budgets or removing a lot of gaps. I'm not saying that we definitely need to have differentiation in terms of um, opportunities, but definitely there needs to be, if women or marginalized communities have been intentionally removed from the population in the history, we have to bring intentional policies and opportunities to bring them back to the workforce. And that's how we can bring inclusive workforce, which builds inclusive and unbiased AI systems.
Right, thank you, Francie. And that gives me a nice cue to introduce Danielle. Danielle, you have been working, your work has emphasized democratic resilience and pluralistic governance in relation to AI technology. How do you think that democracies should adapt to AI-driven transformation? And, what are the risks when democracies don't manage this technology correctly?
Thanks so much, Luca. I appreciate it. I apologize to have made it into the Zoom a little late, sort of technological confusions, but I'm glad to be here. Thank you for this important conversation. I do think the question of the relationship between democracy and AI is fundamental. We are watching democratic institutions strain all around the globe. I take their strain and fragility to reflect how challenging it is to navigate a rapidly transforming economy and set of social structures. And of course, the rapid transformations of our economy and social structures are largely driven by technology. So, in that regard, for democratic institutions to navigate this time successfully, they have to renovate themselves for adaptability and resilience. And they need to renovate themselves rapidly. In other words, they need governance capacity, where governance capacity is about being able to navigate the policy requirements of the changing economic landscape. And those policy requirements are hard because stakeholders are concentrating power and capital in technology companies, which produce a lot of resistance to the kind of regulation and policy regimes that we need. So, what are we to do about that? There are a few different features of renovation that are important, as well as I think some important ways of thinking about the sort of the politics of pursuing regulation of AI. With regard to renovation itself, it's important to see democracy and representative democracy specifically as, in some sense, having a sort of institutional spine. That institutional spine has vertebrae, which make a democratic system functional. So the sort of first vertebra is the vertebra of citizen participation. The second vertebra is the vertebra of decision makers making their decisions, whether they are elected officials or appointed public servants. And then the third vertebra is the question of how those decisions are executed. That might be delivery of services, or it might be enforcement of regulation. And every single one of those vertebrae can be improved for better governance capacity. So, citizen participation, as you know, can be massively improved through AI sense-making tools. We have examples in Taiwan. We have examples through work with organizations that focus on citizens' assemblies, but are using AI, again, both to improve facilitation and to improve sense making. The importance of that set of tools and the work on that vertebra is it actually helps rebuild legitimacy, the connection of people to governing institutions. And democratic institutions need that legitimacy in order to do the hard work of tackling some of the tough regulatory challenges. Similarly, there's an organization called PopVox, which is working with legislatures around the world to bring AI to bear on improving the decision making of decision makers. Many legislatures are at this point overwhelmed by long paper histories of prior decisions that slow down their ability to process precedent, process information, frame decisions, truly understand trade-offs and stakeholders. AI can, again, accelerate that kind of learning and discovery to support legislators in more rapidly framing up policy solutions to our hard problems. In other words, democracy has often seemed slow compared to other political systems, but AI can actually help speed up the functioning of democratic decision making. And then lastly, with regard to implementation, again, whether enforcement or service delivery, there, of course, we all are already aware of the ways in which working with data tools, AI can, again, increase efficiencies. The important thing is that the design principle for the deployment of AI in the implementation phase shouldn't be efficiency alone. It's important that the deployment of tools at that stage also be for the values of openness, accountability, and transparency. In other words, one wants a package of democratic design principles to guide how AI is put to work in the implementation dimension of government practices and governance. The last thing I want to say here is then not about the institutions of democracy, but about the politics of democracy. One of the challenges, again, in our landscape is that, of course, technology companies are concentrating capital and power. And that does mean it's important to build countervailing sources of power. The people are a countervailing source of power, but people need to understand the actual choices that are in front of us as a society right now. So there is a very significant job to do of public education around the impacts of AI on society so that people can themselves give voice to alternatives. One, I think, very fruitful pathway of education relates to how we talk about labor and think about labor. I have been pleased to see here in the United States some state level policy development where, for example, the governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Shapiro, has established a policy whereby the use of AI in his government in Pennsylvania needs to be human complementing, not human supplementing. And that simple expression of principle that AI should be human complementing, not human replacing, sorry, I said that wrong, human complementing instead of human replacing, that principle educates all those who think about labor and the place of labor in the economy and can rapidly develop an alternative political counterweight to the concentration of power that we see with technology companies. So I think engaging in the conversation about labor and how AI fits in with labor, and again, really stressing the principle that we should aim for human complementing AI instead of human replacing AI will be an important part of the public education needed to protect democratic governance. I'll stop there. I hope that was responsive to your question.
Thank you, Danielle. And I would like to touch on the point of how AI will transform the world of labor shortly. But since you were mentioning AI as an enabler for democratic processes, I wanted to ask Ziad. Mozilla has often championed openness and public interest technology. I'd like to hear from you what structural elements are essential for building an AI ecosystem that serves the public good.
And thanks so much for having me today. It'll come as no surprise that I second note almost everything Danielle has been saying just prior to me speaking right now, especially on the values of openness. It's been an interesting time. I think Mozilla is in the space now where we have been wanting to do for AI what we did, which is the point of what Danielle has mentioned, create a countervailing force, countervailing movements to ensure that there's not this concentration of power in a digital ecosystem. And so those are the core aims of what we hope to do with AI. We put out a trustworthy AI report in 2020 before the kind of explosion of ChatGPT, because we recognized that this was going to become something that was going to change the face of the earth, which it has. To those points, there are kind of two thrusts to that. The one is obviously openness. The open source, open ecosystem that many folks on this call have already mentioned, and now most recently, is core to this. It's an enabling layer for innovation. It is an enabling layer for transparency. It is a democratizing function in particular when many people can participate in the development of tech. So openness for us has a very strong valence with democratic values, and it's why we champion it. The second is public AI. And for public AI, we mean public use, public orientation, public goods. How are we ensuring that, again, and these are not unrelated facets, how are we ensuring that your everyday citizen, your community members across the world are able to create partnerships with the private sector, with their governments, with other civil society actors to actually produce and generate outcomes that benefit them, so that they're not net receivers of AI systems, which is what a lot of people actually feel. They feel very acutely as users of a system, which is a familiar phenomenon that we've experienced with the advent of the internet and digital technologies, that whole categories of the populace have been reduced to simply users rather than owners in an economy and in a social system that is based online, in which they are increasingly marginalized from participation. So those are the thrusts of the work that we're aiming to do. I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy challenge. And Mozilla has always been kind of the underdog in the fight against bigger capital pools and concentrations of power, but it's one that we think is super important. I wanted to add a little bit because I felt that there's so many amazing perspectives on this call, but is related to our thrust and how we're conducting our work in AI, which is that another institution often not represented on this call, but I think particularly salient for AI4People in particular, is the art and cultural institutions. So very recently, the foundation in particular at Mozilla has made a concerted effort to ensure that arts and culture, traditionally underinvested both in private and public sector, are included in the conversation, and not just included, but actually leading conversations on AI. This is a dramatic shift in how things are ordinarily done. It's important because it asks very core questions about why. Why do we want AI? What life do we want to lead? What is this all for? These are fundamental human questions that we need to be able to answer. And the people who answer them the best are those who imagine these worlds. There's a reason why Los Angeles and Hollywood, for example, was ground zero for some of the huge AI debates around labor, around intellectual property, continued to be the case, right? You were coming up against a plethora of issues that challenge our very notion of what art, imagination, and creativity are. So in this kind of vector of different groups that constitute a people, a global populace, I think it's really important that we increase our investments, increase our focus, and increase our intention as well to cultural institutions, to cultural actors, to artists and creatives as well. And that's also part of the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Ziad. Of course, you bring a trade union perspective. So I'd like to understand, well, first of all, if you have any reaction to what has been said until now, and secondly, how do you see this, what's your labor perspective on AI integration in the workplace?
Sorry, Luca, I got cut out a little bit. Was that directed at me?
No, sorry, this was for Aida. Apologies for my connection.
I also, it was also a cut from my side. Thank you, Luca, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, well, from my side, I think that labor is a key piece in the puzzle of AI, as many speakers have said. Here from Brussels, I think that the most interesting AI deployments or AI systems happen in workplaces, and the most interesting or surprising high risks uses happening in workplaces. So these systems that are recruiting people, selecting, profiling, discriminating, assigning tasks, deciding who gets the job and who does not, or who gets fired or not, or who gets better wages. They are interesting cases that some of them have attracted the eye of regulators, and some of them have even had some sanctions and high penalties. So workplaces are also the hub of where innovation happens. And from a labor perspective, I would say that if the protections, whether it is in the good infrastructure and it's in the social protections and in the labor law or legal protections are not there, then the labor movement and the people will be harmed. And one of the things that the European Union did a few years ago was to establish these structural protections, at least in the legal framework. We have these data protection rules, the General Data Protection Regulation, then all the digital laws with the AI Act at the forefront. And now Europe is at the crossroads in looking at whether to simplify those rules that have created a framework for people and for trust and for excellence, or whether doing something else. Labor also sits in a global perspective. The European workforce has these protections overall. However, other workforces in other jurisdictions might be perhaps in a different level of protections and suffering from other situations. So I would like to link it with the conversation that you had before with other speakers about scalability and about ethical guidelines. So yes, Europe is not the only one producing ethical frameworks or legal frameworks. We have UNESCO also having recommendations, or the OECD having policy recommendations that are practically imported to other jurisdictions. And we have the Council of Europe and perhaps other UN agencies. The International Labour Organization is also planning to do an observatory on AI and in platform work. So Europe is not the only one, whether it is at the forefront. There are other things happening and emerging. State law in the US, it's also a very good example of what is happening. And I think that in order to avoid fragmentation and to provide protection to people, jurisdictions have to learn from each other and import those provisions that are socially just and can protect as many people as possible.
Thank you, Aida. I would like to go back to Senai, precisely to follow up on that. I mean, we saw ethical principles, governance principles flourishing across the globe. Could count a few dozens of that coming from companies, public institutions, international organizations. But is anyone checking if these principles are truly applied? Are there, we know that the model evaluation is sort of a science that it's in its infancy, but do you see any framework for ensuring that these AI technology are aligned to the societal values that are sort of enshrined in these initiatives?
Thank you for the question. What I see is a lot of initiatives, a lot of frameworks, a lot of guidelines on ethics, on co-creation, and so on emerging worldwide, which is good. There's an attempt at least being done to come to such guidelines and frameworks. What is less good is the fact that there's a lot of ethics washing. The fact that institutions engage with frameworks, engage with citizens is being used as a meaningful or portrayed as a meaningful progress, which often is not the case. Which brings me back to the point that I made earlier about lots of failures that I see when it comes to really making AI technology for people, or even better, with people. I think what we are missing, at least in my experience, is I think Daniela mentioned institutional spine. What I'm missing is institutional humility. Either from academia, from industry, from the public sector. I think humility is a necessity for humanity, in the sense of, if we really want to make AI work for people, advance democracy, then we need to be able to listen to the real needs of people, marginalized or not. And we need not only to listen, we need to engage and co-create and have co-ownerships of the things that we create. And this is, in my opinion, missing structurally. Lots of talks about frameworks, about ethics, and locally it does occasionally work, but we're not able to scale it up because we miss this institutional humility locally, nationally, internationally.
Thank you. I'd like to hear Pierre's reaction on what you just said. Is this an institutional problem? Are basically democratic institutions struggling to sort of protect fundamental rights in a world where decision-making will be increasingly driven by algorithms?
Okay, I would like to again reverse the point of view, because we are speaking about the good for the people, about ethics, about institutions, but it seems to me that we forget the fundamental responsibility of the people, of everybody, of the users of AI, because ethics is something that is it's personal responsibility. And I think that we should really push for an education that gives the actual users and future users the ability to have ethical use of AI, and to give young people the critical thinking abilities to use it in an ethical way. For example, develop the personal memorization. Don't delegate your memory to the machines. Practice regularly abstraction and synthesis. Question at length rather than settle for first answers. Always replace facts within the multiple contexts from which they get their meaning. And finally, let's take responsibility for the messages we entrust to digital memory, because this information contributes to shape AI models and finally our collective intelligence. Okay, so AI now is the interface between individual and the reified collective intelligence, and every aspect of this ecosystem has a responsibility, not only the models and the institutions and the company that create these AI models, but also the public and the individuals.
Thank you, Pierre. Jacob, Pierre is putting the emphasis at the individual level, but at the institutional level, how do you see European countries dealing with this? For instance, how are the legal tradition and the constitutional traditions in Europe shaping the way the EU is approaching AI governance?
Thanks. I want to slightly change the premise of your question a little bit, just to respond to Pierre a tiny bit, but I think I should answer it. in that I agree with the premise that he's talking about of at least in the premise of the collective intelligence and how important that is for shaping, say, future AI. Wholeheartedly agree. But I think the problem here is that the focusing on the individual, and this kind of points to your question about the legal attitude towards this, is we often look at designing principles and policy interventions at the downstream user interaction level. And I think this is a mistake. And the reason I think this is a mistake is most of the empirical evidence we have in the last 2 years, I mean, going back more than that, but even just in the last 2 years of AI interaction says that trying to design at the user interaction level doesn't work. I mean, let's think of something like Pierre brought up things like AI literacy training, or or engaging young people to understand what kind of products they're working with. This could be things like disclosure or watermarking of AI products. These are all good things. I mean, these are all necessary things. I just don't think they're sufficient for the kinds of things that a lot of these the legal prescriptions of what we want to do are after. So like, for instance, I think of something like disclosure. So I think the premise here is that if people know that they're interacting with AI, then they can adjust accordingly, right? I'm not going to offload all of my cognitive work to this AI because I know I'm working with an AI. But the evidence seems to be showing that even if they know they're working with an AI, they still do this. So, for instance, I'll just rattle off a couple. There's a study where like 80% of participants believe that they were uninfluenced by an AI moral advice, even though you look at their actual judgments and they correlate perfectly with that AI advice, even when they say, oh, no, I'm not doing that. Another one where I think it's around 50% of participants, oh, no, more than, sorry, it's different than that. It was that AI was 50% more effective than, say, static messages at shifting political attitudes because it was personalized. Again, this is when it was disclosed to the users and participants that they're using AI. So disclosure doesn't seem to appear as a function as like a reliable safeguard. Most people who know they're interacting with AI are influenced anyway, and they believe they're not. This is true when we talk about things of training for AI literacy. This is true when we're talking about certain forms of explainability measurements, that it suggests that most people, most of the time, don't notice when their judgment is being shaped. And so the legal interventions of different countries around Europe are taking this kind of user-focused end level, let's put the responsibility on the end user to be super ethical in this. And it's necessary, but it is not sufficient to solve the kinds of problems that we're worried about, particularly when we're talking about, I think it was exactly what Pierre is saying, in the collective autonomy, right? This collective will of having a deliberative democracy, something Danielle, I think, was also talking about as well, of having this diversity of inputs, the ability to have good conversations and good arguments that aren't influenced by, say, some homogenous kind of monolithic point of view. I think that somewhat answered your question, but maybe not completely.
Yeah,
just
Pierre, go for it.
Sorry, just a very quick response. I just wanted to balance the perspective. I don't say that institutional aspects and regulation are bad, not at all. Because I am a teacher and I work a lot with teachers who are confronted with students who are using AI constantly. So I wanted to introduce just a different point of view, not saying that what I say is just what everybody should be doing. No, just to balance the perspective. That's it.
Thank you, Pierre. I wanted to turn to Olaf now, because these ethical discussions are taking place in a moment where we have a very fierce international race between corporations and between companies and between countries on who develops the most sophisticated AI technologies. And we see also that, when competition in a very high stake markets take place, safety and ethics are not necessarily the primary concern. In the US, there is, of course, quite an obsession about being outpaced by China. And now we see this logic also sort of taking hold in Brussels as well. Do you think that, these ethical considerations, do they even have a space in this technological race? And what are the risks of, such a powerful technology being concentrated in the hands of a few countries or a few corporations?
Yeah, those are the key questions of the moment right now. I would just tell you, Luca, to reframe the question a little bit. We are actually seeing a values race that is tied into an economic race. The reason for why we are seeing the competition between the United States and China is not necessarily and only one of economics, but also one of values. It is really democracy against autocracy. And that's how it's being framed by key decision makers. You may not agree with the values that the United States, for instance, is promulgating around the world, especially under the current administration, but they're nonetheless values, and we can have a conversation about those values. I think where the administration differs now from a previous administration and from most of what we're hearing out of Europe is that in order to win the values race, we have to win the economic race. And therein lies the crux of the problem. I agree with everything that has been said here that we need to have human centricity, that we need to have governance systems that facilitate that human centricity. And we also need to step away from a principles focused conversation to one that is more operationalized ethics. What do I mean by that? I think we have arrived at a stage where most democracies around the world will agree on certain types of values. We may well rank them differently, but we don't necessarily disagree on their existence. What we are failing at the moment, to be very clear, is how to instruct entrepreneurs and large corporations, whether by way of regulation or by way of operationalized governance systems, on how to implement those ethical values. Venture capitalists need to fund staff that is dedicated to instituting these ethical safeguards in a way that integrates with operations. There are companies that do that rather well. If you're looking at Salesforce, for instance, they have a whole group of people that are ethical design architects that step to the side of product developers in order to make sure that what is being developed is inclusive of stakeholder values from day one. And in fact, it does not have to slow down product developers, but rather has the benefit that on the back end, as the products get released, you won't have backlash from certain stakeholders that require greater protections, right? And that prohibits class action lawsuits, etc. That kind of integration of ethics and economics needs to happen at greater scale. There is a false notion out there amongst innovators that being ethical has to slow you down in this race toward economic supremacy from artificial intelligence. And what makes that even worse is that we're currently, and let's be very honest about this, we're currently not seeing the return on investment across most corporations in the United States and globally on all of these AI investments. Let's not forget that we're seeing about $4.6 trillion of AI investments slushing around Silicon Valley alone. And so, as people are trying to recover the return, they are, of course, going to the low-hanging fruit, and that low-hanging fruit is disregarding people and their dignity and their productivity. So that's why you're also seeing this over-reliance on a rather ill-conceived narrative of FTE reduction, meaning layoffs and reduction of labor cost. So this comes full circle to say that, again, people are starting to not prioritize values because they put economics first in order to make values live, compromising values and ethics in the process. So we need to have interventions from the regulators, of course, but also from corporate leadership, from the C-level on down, that says we have to focus away from a pure focus on FTE reduction, cost cutting, to more value creation, to more dignity for the employee, for labor, while striving for higher productivity. That will then close the loop of economics and ethics. So that's where we are today, unfortunately. The two are fighting each other when they really should be integrated.
Thank you, Olaf. Ziad, would you like to react to what Olaf just said? Is, the fact that a large American company would win the tech race a good thing for democracies by itself? Or, are there certain risks in sort of a current market player dominating this market as well?
So I want to respond to a couple of things, which is firstly that I fully agree with Olaf on the need for a reevaluation and rethinking about how we are teaching folk to think about the basic relationship between technology and ethics in entrepreneurial culture. The move fast, Luca, when you started, you started with the move fast and break things principle. It's been such a pernicious adage to overcome in so many circles with young computer scientists, young entrepreneurs who think that ethics is a byproduct, a negative externality to be mitigated and to handled in a particular way. And I think there's just that alone is a massive cultural shift that needs to change, because the true innovators, the true geniuses, the true cultures and collectives who push society forward are those who can think on the systems level in both domains. And those who are going to be shaping the societies, the systems, the futures, not just the technologies. And so getting folk to really realize that actually ethics is not separate from, it is actually core to being the responsible technologist is a step above, a cut above the kind of move fast and break things person or culture of genius that is kind of pernicious again in the US, is such a huge cultural shift that we need to address. So I just want to emphasize that point because I fully agree with it. I come across it all of the time. And that's my response, is that we can very clearly see that we need a cultural shift in how we are educating folk and what we value. The US context is obviously very consolidated. We've seen this, emerge over the last few years with a set of dominant players. It has been interesting, I will say, to see the new administration's focus on open source. And the geopolitics behind that assessment. That was not a previous focus. The G7 before, for example, did not have a statement on open models and open as it did this past session. And part of that is because there is a need for a diversifying, thinking through the entire ecosystem for AI, and maybe in the US sense, putting forward companies that are at different levels or have different intervention spaces within a global ecosystem that can gravitate between both proprietary and open models. So it's been interesting to see investments being made in an open ecosystem within the US. Nevertheless, the US remains very concentrated and globally dominant. These things are not these things are challenges to address because they propagate throughout the world. They change the set of norms and values with which other countries emulate, operate, the space for maneuver, compete. And I think that from our vantage, from the vantage of the Mozilla Foundation in particular, what we'd like to see is more choice, lesser concentration of power, more people power in the development of tech. And so we support initiatives throughout the global south, from Kenya to India, where new organizations, civil society actors, companies are effectively leapfrogging in different vantage points into different intervention spaces in the AI economy to effectively compete in areas where the US has got a monopoly. Through different means. Resource-constrained environments produce innovation. We've seen that, for example, in Kenya with M-Pesa, way back when digital was the buzzword, and now AI is the buzzword. But we've seen how how constraints in general can produce massive innovation. And so, as much as I would like to say, yes, there's a massive problem in the US with industry consolidation, I'm also very hopeful about the future because comparatively resource constrained environments will tend to produce innovations that we're going to be seeing more of, and I'm excited for that.
Thank you, Ziad. Anthony, how do you react to that? You obviously belong to a very large industrial group. Do you see these dominance by US companies and potentially also Chinese companies? And do you see them like setting the global standards in terms of how this technology is being developed?
Yeah, so even though I'm based in the US, I work for a large Japanese company, so I bring kind of more that perspective. The point that Olaf made earlier about the, kind of economic race versus the values race and operationalizing ethics, I think is an interesting one. It reminds me of, discussions several years ago that we were having in the company, when a lot of sustainability related measures were being rolled out. And at the time, it seemed like, oh, sustainability is a kind of a trade-off with economics. And, I think we've come to realize that it's not. It by itself adds a lot of value, and it should be kind of positioned to kind of grow the business in a value-added way. So they kind of promote the term trade-on now, instead of considering it as a trade-off. And I tend to think, the discussion earlier was reminding me of that. And I tend to think ethics can be kind of positioned in a very similar way, that, it is itself a value to be kind of having products, having services that are kind of ethical, and, value kind of human values and so on. So.
Thank you, Anthony. Daniel, just to build on Olaf's point on the need for public intervention, how should public authorities ensure that, these ethical considerations are taken into account by private corporations that, of course, are their priorities turn a profit?
I really appreciate the formulation that was just offered, the shift from the concept of trade-off to trade-on. I have a slightly different way of talking about that, but I think it's important. It is possible to optimize for multiple values simultaneously, and often optimization is about creativity, about identifying solution pathways that may not have been evident at first. So there is a challenge in our policymaking landscape where people are trained to sort of analyze potential policy choices and then to ask immediately what are the trade-offs among these things. Instead, what one should really ask first is which values is each deficient on, and is there a way to creatively redesign that policy so you could actually optimize for multiple values simultaneously? And people should do that exercise before they default to considering trade-offs. And I think it's actually a kind of an analytical muscle that we have to build for policymakers. But there's no reason we can't build it into practice. And if we do that, we can build those key ethical principles sort of into what people consider upfront as a matter of course over and over again.
Thank you. Fringy, I could see you nodding while Daniel was speaking. How does diversity and inclusion, how can this be included into this discussion?
So in order to have the diversity included in these conversations, the most important aspect is to have representations where these decisions, where these policies are developed. So, having civil societies like, Women in AI, or organization representing a specific community or indigenous populations being present and their voices being heard is super important when it comes to understanding the hidden the hidden challenges or the hidden needs that are not met by the AI technology from product or from policy perspective. If you think about like the AI regulation in or AI governance, what's happening globally. Certain countries have adopted regulations. Certain countries have adopted voluntary policies, and again, majority in North America, we're moving towards more voluntary guidelines and corporate reporting and so on and so forth. So in these situations, there is always a pressure in terms of winning the AI race versus adapting or adopting the responsible AI governance. Whether to become accurate or whether to become safe. So in these situations, again, organizations that supports or that are neutral could help come in and bring out the discrepancies or the harms, or become like a third party auditor in a sense, to kind of bring out those hidden harms that could come from these AI products. So, for example, Dr. Joy had come up with her research on how facial recognition systems has been failing. So, institutes like that really stands as a voice to bring more equity or more equity in terms of how AI products are being developed, as well as how it is being utilized. I would also look into my work with World Economic Forum, or within Canada, Standards Council Canada. When we all look into building or adopting or looking at frameworks that exist today, and also what we need in future to kind of bridge the gap. Of course, there are a lot of frameworks that exist, but what is missing is the agility. What is missing is the adaptive governance capability. So how flexible are today's governance frameworks to the risk that we do not know as of now? So while we work with voluntary guidelines, while we work with some foundational regulatory frameworks, we also need to have certain abilities where we have this foundational core concepts that is being implemented at corporate, at small medium businesses, at government level, but also flexibility to adapt as the technology keeps moving. We also look at responsible AI, or corporates look at responsible AI as more like a policy, and there's a lot of gap that we have been seeing in terms of how responsible AI is considered as a term or a policy versus how it is operationalized within the organizations as well. So more recently, we have seen a lot of focus, from organizations on responsible AI, like how building like an office for responsible AI, giving as much importance to responsible AI as much as giving to AI development, but only a comprehensive way of operationalizing responsible AI can enable the entire life cycle of AI to be accountable, traceable, transparent, and also capable of monitoring end to end as well. So in Canada, as part of the standardization strategies, the more focus is given on adopting policies that is more interoperable, so ensuring that countries can work with each other, but at the same time there is also sector specific challenges that is there. So and we are also more focused on small medium businesses as well, while corporates are looking at building responsible AI frameworks and showcase following voluntary guidelines. They have the resources. There is also the small medium businesses who do not have the resources, who do not have the capabilities to understand how do they actually um, know how to build responsibly or how to use responsibly. So that kind of education on how do we actually implement responsible AI or adopt responsible AI in the build as well as the usage is also necessary in across all the different stages or the different sizes of businesses. And finally, to talk about in academia as well, we are also working with universities, with students, with girls specifically. Um, there is a lot of need for AI literacy, but also there's a lot of education that needs to be given to how to use AI more safely. So several universities have adopted different policies on whether they can make use of AI in their day-to-day projects and cases and projects and exams and stuff. But at the same time, we also need to ensure that these younger generations are ready for tomorrow or what is coming tomorrow, because the world that they are entering is completely different from what we have today or what we have entered in when we came into workforce. So the education, the risk understanding, but also to make sure that the skill gap is reduced when they enter workforce is also required. So from my perspective, definitely, we talked about diversity, but AI governance and, looking at corporate, looking at small businesses, looking at different sectors and looking at the academia. So in every different parts, we need to have specific guidelines.
Thank you, Francie. Turning to Aida, I want to follow up on what Francie said on, involving civil society, and specifically for the world of AI in the workplace. What role do you see for trade unions in negotiating with employers? What could be the limits for AI in the workplace? Could collective bargaining be the right tool, to the right way to go, or do you see other instruments that could be used? Thank you.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Luca, again. And at the workplace, trade unions have been present in negotiating automation since many, many years ago, really. The history of collective bargaining on automation is quite broad everywhere in Europe and also in the United States, including the space race, where a very, very big strike happened many years ago. So new technologies and collective bargaining or labor involvement is always connected. Collective bargaining on AI is not new, and we have various examples about that. Again, in both sides of the continents. I would like to recall that very interesting strike of the Writers Guilds of America, the script writers that write the films that we watch in the movies or in Netflix. almost for 200 days, they had a strike in order to avoid generative AI to writing scripts for them. The conclusion of this strike was a collective agreement. And in this collective agreement, the companies agreed that generative AI, will not be used by script writers to write their pieces unless the script writers would really, really need to. So here, when you ask me about the limits, this is one very clear example of where to put the red line. In this case, because generative AI can write text very well, apparently, well, it is up to the scriptwriters to decide at what point in time and whether it is useful or not to rely on generative AI. And at the moment, there is a red button. It is not allowed to be used, and the power is on the worker. So that's a very interesting collective agreement that can be translated to other jurisdictions. For example, another collective agreement had been signed with major banks in the financial sector in Europe, because the banking sector has been automatized very broadly. And here, for example, a lot of precautions have been put in terms of data. What type of data can be extracted from workers? It was very common to film workers in the banking sector to see how would they talk, what type of words they would use vis-a-vis the clients so that they can really secure good contracts. And now with the practice, collective agreements have managed to put a limit to facial recognition systems or identification of being angry or using the wrong or right words, the personality test of banking employees. And here, for example, they have really also said, well, we don't need this in our banking sector. We do perhaps need something else. There is a red button as well. So collective agreements can really model the needs of the workers for the specific sector, because I do believe that not all the sectors are equal and not all the workers are exposed to AI systems in the same way. For example, teachers, university teachers are constantly being recorded by webcams, which are also measuring their facial expressions and whether they appear empathetic to students, and then ranking them whether they are good teachers or not. So you see, all the sectors have their particularities, and collective agreements can model the provisions of the AI Act, for example, for one sector or the other. I also think that in terms of regulation, well, the AI Act, it's a very horizontal framework that talks about labor in a very scattered manner. And there are some provisions about, again, emotion recognition with a very specific exception for medical issues. There is also an exception, a provision on biometric identification, and most of the uses of AI systems for work, recruitment, and allocation of tasks, automated decisions, and monitoring are deemed to be high risk. However, we know that every workplace is special, and it's very up to the deployers or the employers to decide whether this is going to be really a high risk or not. And to respond again to your question, this is a place for trade unions or workers' representatives, because they have the capacity to analyze risk very well. They have a whole baggage on health and safety risk assessment, which can be translated to AI/data risk assessment. In deciding what is a high risk or not, what requires a transparency measure or not, trade unions have a role, and workers' representatives, in my view, can become data representatives as well, and together with the employers can really decide whether an AI system is posing risk to them according to perhaps another evaluation criteria. So that's a role for them, very concretely and very practical. Another role for them will be for the public sector, for example. Workers will be to be involved in conducting the so-called fundamental rights impact assessments here in Europe, and if they are not available in Europe, there are similar impact assessments in other jurisdictions where workers can be also involved. And the last part, perhaps, of work where I see working involvement is in traditional training. So everywhere in the world, we have provisions related to employers providing training, skills, and long-term capacity to employees. In Europe, we have acquired a new term, which is AI literacy, that talks about broad skills, etc. That should not be an excuse to not provide formal education to the workforce. But coming back to the global jurisdictions and provisions on skills, here's also where trade unions or workers' representatives can step in. Because by looking at how their own skills are being transformed or assessing how the skills they need, they can also team up with employers and see that and decide that perhaps the next skilling program should be dedicated to this or one topic. So that's really working in conjunction with employers and in many areas and at very levels of the implementation of the AI systems, and also in deciding which AI systems perhaps are not really useful at the workplace. The same as they did with machines in industrial settings which didn't really work and which caused accidents or just didn't work. Those are very practical suggestions of how to bring these two actors together. Back to you.
Thank you, Aida. I wanted to turn to Daniel now, because what Aida just said sort of prompt a thought. Daniel, I don't want you to start a Marxist analysis, but do you see this AI integration and the fact that, you know, it is reshaping labor relationship as yet another struggle between capital and workers, or is it just natural technological development that makes certain categories redundant as it has done in the past? And what role, you know, should democratic institutions have? Should they let the technology decide who are the economic winners and losers, or should they sort of manage this process, and how?
I take it that was for me. Was that right?
Yeah.
All right. So no, I mean, we have a lot of hard questions of political economy in front of us right now. I think the most important thing to say, for starters, is that there are varieties of capitalism. So in that regard, it's not a sort of conversation about sort of capitalism versus just alternatives, socialism, communism, or whatever. But it's, I think, even more importantly that we have a conversation about varieties of capitalism. And that means varieties of potential approaches to steering the economy and regulating the economy. So it's completely within the frame of thinking about capitalism to think about how economic policy can empower populations. There's a really good book by somebody named Malcolm Salter called The Fading Light of Democratic Capitalism and What to Do About It, which I would really recommend. And it focuses on questions of corporate governance, corporate decision-making, but also the question of the place of labor in the economy. It does matter that policies steer toward good jobs and good wages for people. This conference has an overarching frame of thinking about human flourishing. And by definition, to think about human flourishing is to think about the well-being of populations. And you can't put that question aside or consider it answered simply by thinking about growth and innovation. So the economic questions really put us sort of back in the place of needing to think about several values simultaneously. And if you think about how does an economy empower people, one of the core questions you have to ask is, what is the experience of work? And so, yes, I mean, AI is upending how work is structured and operating, but we shouldn't just take it that there's some kind of course of how that's going to unfold is sort of given from the heavens. To the contrary, however it will unfold will be a matter of human choice, will be a matter of our regulatory frameworks. And so then the question is, what principles are we using to design those regulatory frameworks? Do they include respect for labor, the idea that people should be empowered with good jobs, and that healthy populations are the goal, not growth in itself, that growth it has to support healthy populations. And if you sort of put them in that order of priority in relationship to each other, then I think you have the right framework for policymaking.
Thank you, Daniel. And since you mentioned a book, what you told me just reminded me of another book. I cannot recall the title right now, but it basically said that one of the reasons why the US won the Cold War was that its sort of dispersed societal approach allowed technological uptake faster than in the Soviet Union. Olaf, how do you see what Daniel mentioned about being there are different forms of capitalism and how, for instance, the Chinese approach to maintaining social control with technology can impact the international tech race?
Yeah, look, the Chinese model is really one of political stability and especially political stability of the Chinese Communist Party. The survivability, sustainability, power base of the party is really front and center of Xi Jinping's mind, and everything else is subordinate to that. We've also seen recent research being done by Pat McGee and others. You remember the book that just came out on Apple in China, for instance. What kind of fate labor in China sometimes suffers. And I don't want to go into that rabbit hole at this point, but there are some very significant questions there about the role of labor in China. While it is a pseudo-communist system, it is not necessarily one that treats labor very well. And so I don't think that's necessarily a role model for any of us in the West. But I do think we also have to take a critical eye toward labor and jobs here in the United States and in Europe as well. We have statistics out there, such as 60% of all people not liking the work that they're doing, that should incentivize us to see artificial intelligence not just as a risk and a threat that needs protecting against, but also as an opportunity for people to actually live richer professional lives that are more rewarding for them psychologically, but also financially, right? So when people are not happy with their jobs, why is that the case? There could be many reasons, of course, and there's also studies out there that say people are never completely happy and have trouble being happy in general. So why should jobs be any different? And of course, we all want to make more money in our jobs to begin with. But I think we need to take these statistics very seriously. And so there is an opportunity here. And I can tell you that in my courses on AI with very young students, undergraduates, all the way to executive MBAs, I do an exercise where I look at somebody's current job, or if they don't have one, the job that they aspire to. And I say, look, let's have a conversation. In fact, this is an assignment in my course where we actually have you look at your current job, project forward how in 2 or 3 years that job will be augmented by AI. Some tasks, maybe meaningfully so, in terms of percentage, will be taken away by artificial intelligence. How do you now recompose that job with the work that you think you want to be doing that is actually higher productivity, higher satisfaction? How do you integrate with the AI? And what training do you then ask the chief of human resources or your hiring manager for in order to integrate with AI? The goal should not be competition with AI because humans can't win that. If we compete on a pure efficiency and computational power basis, we cannot win. It should rather be understanding what tasks AI should be taking and what tasks I want to retain. And so we need to give workers agency in helping define what those roles are, especially in situations when chief human resource officers and the government are not doing the job that they should be doing, right? So let's not pretend that our current job profiles are the holy grail. that every job is worth protecting. Is it really? Or should we be seeing this as an opportunity to redesign the future jobs that are more agency providing, more creative, and at the same time, higher productivity?
Right. I take your point, Olaf. At the same time, um, I mean, it might seem a silly joke, but we have AI chatbots able to write poetry and produce wonderful paintings. At the same time, people are still washing their dishes. They're still doing, their groceries. So is AI, my question is perhaps directed to Senai. How can we develop an AI that truly complements the human, and where who gets to write, what's the ethical limit of that? Who gets to write to decide, what which task is correct to give to an automated system, and which tasks should remain only for humans? Is at the end, generative AI in particular is sort of posing challenges to what could be human creativity itself.
Thanks for the question. Let me to answer your question again, 2 book recommendations. One is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and the other is The Pedagogy of Liberation, again by Paulo Freire. I think his seminal work, Paulo Freire is the Brazilian thinker, educator, lawyer, who wrote these seminal books 50, 70 years ago. Lots of what he writes, I think, still holds now, and perhaps holds even more now. In his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he shows how we live in a cycle of socialization or a cycle of oppression. You get born into a world with assumptions, with certain structures. You go to school where these assumption structures are enforced, church, and so on. So he shows nicely that we live in this cycle of socialization. And I think much of the AI technologies that we are building, that we have thrown into society in the last 2 decades, have been socialized also in this cycle. There's always ways out of the cycle of oppression, cycle of socialization, into the cycle of liberation. Often we do, or communities tend to do that when an incident happens. Then they think, how can we deal with this incident? And go into the cycle of liberation. The way we approach AI in my group is to build AI specifically with the aim of going out of this cycle of socialization and going into the cycle of liberation. And this cycle of liberation, as written in his second seminal book, is all about empowerment. It's all about community building, about collective transformation. So this is disconnected from the AI that we know now, but it applies certainly to AI as well. If we approach AI with the aim of enabling this transition from cycle of socialization to cycle of liberation, then you, by nature, by design, have to deal with, okay, what are the ethical values in this community? How can we use AI to enable these values, right? And again, the cycle of socialization revolves around the ethics of life, of market. These are terms coined by Paulo Freire. And ethics, the cycle of liberation, revolves around the ethics of life. Much of the discussions that we now have in this panel can be freely translated to his thinking. So my short answer, let's develop AI as an enabler of going out of this cycle of socialization in this cycle of liberation. And that way of thinking allows you to more easily deal with regulations, ethics, innovation, and so forth. Hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Shania. Ziad, I would like to follow up on that because what Shania mentioned goes in favor of an open governance for especially frontier AI models. But at the same time, what we are seeing is that this market is highly concentrated in in the hands of a few providers that usually have very closed ecosystem, proprietary models. So, how does this market structure impact this sort of need for inclusiveness and do you envisage any accountability shortcomings in the near future?
Um, Thanks so much for that. I'm going to start off with something that I kind of very firmly believe in, which is it is foolhardy and foolish to expect that our society around us will not mirror the kinds of structures and institutions that we have in place technologically. If we are building concentrated stacks of highly, consolidated power in private corporations, why should we not expect democratic backsliding? It seems obvious to me. If those are the principles that are operative in a society, then it's foolish to expect that our society is not going to shape itself around that. And so I think that's a core concern for us. Just generally, both personally, but also at the Mozilla Foundation, is that if we don't have open ecosystems, we're not on the path to democracy and maintaining and flourishing our democratic values. And so that's where the intervention space really is for us. Is it's not just a technical principle, openness. It is one that is social. It is political as well. So when we look at these kind of concentrated stacks, consolidated monopolies, both in the U.S. but elsewhere as well, that is something that remains kind of obvious for us in the sense of it is where we should focus our attention to ensure that we have open, free, and flourishing societies, because that's an anathema to it. So that's, I think, the core concern that we have on the level of openness. And I will say that Sine was talking about the liberation potential of AI and moving towards that. The approach here in that again, I feel very strongly for and is part of what we do at the Mozilla Foundation, is to advocate for community-based approaches that are grassroots level. And that sometimes can sound like a cop-out to a lot of people, but it's really not. When you actually sit down with communities, you listen to what they're saying. Danielle talked about citizens' assemblies, but just basic levels of local politics, local community, forms of scale that are horizontal and not necessarily only vertical. You have a very different picture of what people's wants and needs are. You get to understand that a lot of what they're experiencing and using is kind of not just forced upon them, but something that they, again, as I mentioned before, are net receivers of. So an open ecosystem is so necessary for that those local kind of nodes to emerge, to become stronger, for those grassroots organizations, not just within one city, but across cities. Cities talk to each other, to be able to learn from each other. The excuse that we are often faced with as champions of open ecosystems is often around economics and often around security. Proprietary systems are seen as somehow more secure. Again, I'm going to speak personally. I'm going to say I think that's garbage. When you have open ecosystems, you're able to ensure that people can audit it, people have access into it, people can see they can red team it more effectively. There are a bunch of benefits for security from open architectures and ecosystems that you can kind of you can get at first move advantage over as a result of not waiting for things to bottle up through a proprietary system. And on the economic layer, open is like the foundation of so many innovations on the proprietary level. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It's a recognition that we need to have the priority of our investments in open ecosystem as an enabling layer for a proprietary layer that is more diverse, more diffuse, has a broader number of actors, and that's how I see it. To be honest with you.
Thank you, Ziad. Princi, I think this also leads to the question of how we can empower women technologies to shape decision making in frontier AI technologies.
So that's an interesting question. So we also need to first, answer that whether the women technologists are present in those workplaces where these models are being built, and that is the critical gap and the critical, challenge that we are facing that we need to address. I have kind of summarized, a lot of the different initiatives that Women in AI does as a community, and many other civil societies like women in AI does in terms of um, you know empowering the workforce that is already in AI to advance into leadership roles, teach them the leadership skills that they need to take up the roles that they think that they are not really able to do, or that they're stepping away from. If they are not able to enter into a career in work, career in AI, how can we help them to take that first step in the door? And then once they are in, how can we help them upskill on those advanced technology, not just what they've learned from their educational, but also how can they go and work in the frontier models. So we organize several technical focused workshops and coaching sessions, as well as certification programs. We also partner with technology institutes to receive, provide them with cloud credits and AI credits, and also scholarships to break down those barriers where they can access tools and technologies to learn and also do projects and also showcase them with their work. But above all, we truly believe that the real change needs to happen, from schools, from universities, because if you look at the talent pipeline itself, you might see, let's say, like your 23% of workforce, or AI, scientists are women today. In the last 5 to 10 years, that percentages has been almost in that same area. We have seen several organizations coming in and going, and several UN focusing specifically on women education, a lot of the sustainable, the UN specific goals focusing on education, as well as bringing more women in the workforce and also supporting them in terms of education, and also like support with the childcare and so on and so forth. But we still don't see that needle being changed. um, if if you don't even see like 1 or 2% or even 5% change in those representations, it is really hard to even talk about how can diversity be really seen when we build these frontier models, right? So the change has to be made throughout these systems and not just in a specific part of the technology. It has to start from the schools, by educating girls, by giving up the guidance and the trust and the confidence that they can actually take up a STEM career, and then move towards computer science or technology or whatever that they can flourish, and not just arts or language, or like being a teacher or in the service industry or so on and so forth. They can actually take up science, they can all actually go into leadership roles. So that kind of education and confidence has to be built from school, and then going into universities, guiding the undergraduate students, graduate students into what careers exist today, not just being a developer or a data scientist or a machine learning engineer, but how can you be an expert in your own domain and also take AI and advance your career? So how can you become a doctor or a biology student or a science graduate and still upskill on AI and become proficient in what's coming in the future? So to summarize, what I wanted to say is that definitely there is a lot that we have, like there is a lot that we need to um, um, do in terms of even to make a needle change in terms of actually having clear representation in terms of workforce. Um, it this could be just like a passing thought. I'm just here to kind of like give a comment from out of the 10 perspective. This could be just one of the perspective, but the gap really exists in the industry today, and there needs to be more intentional changes that needs to be done in order to see a clear change in that percentage movement in the representation.
Thank you, Francie. I wanted to go back to Anthony. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. I'm just gonna mute. All right. But before I do that, we are quickly running out of time. And I just wanted to give the opportunity to our audience to chip in if they want with questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll do my best to put them to the speakers and also indicate if you have a specific speaker in mind for your question. Anthony, I mean, keeping in mind, all these ethical considerations in terms of inclusiveness, how can you still, remain competitive in such a fast-paced market as a private research lab?
Well, I wanted to circle back. I think there was a lot of great discussion about AI in the workplace. So maybe I try to tie it into your question. But certainly, I think it's really important for us to be considering how, humans fit into this kind of increasingly automated world. And, maybe to your point about the competitiveness, maybe this is one point to consider. And I'll use a simple example from maybe the factory floor. This is kind of where, we see a lot of the questions around labor and, like in manufacturing and production sites. So I think this is probably one of the earlier examples where we're going to see humans and robots kind of working together in very collaborative type settings. We're seeing more and more collaborative robots that can learn tasks, very highly skilled tasks that humans can do with very minimal teaching and instruction. There's certainly still a lot of technology gaps that we need to address to get there. Robots should be able to interpret kind of human intentions very well, even emotions. And we'll need a lot better tools that kind of allow for, some sense of shared planning and autonomy to execute, some given tasks. And, I'm using the factory floor as an example, but I think this applies very widely to a lot of other spaces in transportation, homes, public spaces, and so on. But I think really the core question is, when we have robots and humans interacting in these spaces, how do we keep the human value and human autonomy at the center? And there's been a lot of discussion on the panel about that. And one distinction I think maybe is important to make, like Danielle was talking about earlier, like we want human complementing policies. And maybe a step further to that is we need to make a distinction between kind of the autonomy that AI has and the authority that it has. So, in the systems that I'm talking about, robots and AI systems, they can operate autonomously, on a number of tasks, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have the authority to make final decisions. And this is especially true, I think, for safety critical or ethically sensitive areas. So, coming back to like governance frameworks and policy, I mean, these are things maybe to think about, is this division of responsibility between kind of humans and robots or AI systems in general.
Thank you, Anthony. I would like to turn your question to Ida, actually. How can, AI and automation in robotics, for instance, maintain the human value in production processes?
Can you repeat the last 3 words? How can AI
ensure that we sort of don't lose the human value in production processes?
Okay, we don't lose the human value. Well, that's a thought. That's a point. Yes, there are very interesting machines that can be able to be can work along humans. But the problem is that most of these machines, precisely as the previous speaker said, they are collaborative. It means that their mission or their objective is to extract or that knowledge, learn the pattern of the human, and operate from that point of view. And by learning the pattern of the human, then the machine can improve itself more and go more further to the point that it can bring that human to a point where it's no longer needed. So one of the issues is how to avoid extracting knowledge, experience of the worker while doing a task, one, and how to avoid extracting tacit knowledge, that knowledge that people acquire while doing the craft. So those things are not yet really solved, and nobody has solved them. Well, probably someone, speaking about interesting books, Daron Acemoglu, in his seminal book that got himself a Nobel Prize in economics, who said that as long as we don't change the way we produce AI systems, we are not going to benefit from them. Workers, we will never benefit from them because it's just another form of automation. So we need to make a business model, a very different business model, to make sure that that knowledge is not extracted in order for the machine to replace the human, that experience is not extracted in order for the machine to become better. And that collaboration really needs to keep the human with their jobs and perhaps to give them other jobs that could be very well interesting to do. It's very difficult, Luca, to operationalize this principle of the human in control. It's very easy to do it in an airplane, where the human in control principle was actually born. And we have a lot of literature of that with NASA and how it evolved. So far, pilots are still there. But not all workers are pilots, and not all workplaces are planes. So operationalizing that, again, for a journalist, for a school, for a teacher, for a lawyer, it's not the same. Or for a person who works with a machine in a plant, it's not the same. And more systems are faster because production processes need to be fast in order to get competition. And yes, a little bit more efficient in terms of productivity. But there is nothing. I have been looking at company policies and even laws. Or collective agreements, as you said. There is nothing so far that ensures that that human experience, gathered with knowledge and through years of work, is preserved. On the contrary, several companies have asked workers to teach the machine in order to the machine to become the main driver for the production. And on the other hand, various companies, big tech companies, have announced, and non-big tech, a very big food chain, French name, has announced big lays off people, and they have just publicized it, announced it, like, because we are investing in digitalization. And that is when you realize that, okay, where is a promise of not of keeping the human in the loop, or keeping the workforce, or keeping the human in control, or preserving that human touch? It's not there yet. So I really want to know if someone here in the panel has a solution or an idea to that, because so far I haven't seen it in policies and in the practice. Back to you.
Thank you, Aida. Yeah, let's go to Jacob. My next question was also for you, because again, a sort of philosophical question, how AI could sort of reshape the concept of human autonomy, especially since, it can be very subtle in the way it shapes people's decisions.
Yeah, thanks. Just to speak to Aida's point, because I actually would love to know her opinion on this, because she'll know way more about this than I do. And not that I raised my hand not because I have like the answer and the solution, but the concept of data unions has kind of been kicked around for quite a few years. And a lot of times data unions seem to be kind of put around, oh, it'll be a way for people to collectivize giving their data over to big companies, and then them getting some kind of compensation, so in case, some kind of labor protection. But I'm thinking more of data unions in the sense of using that data and all of this stuff that is given to AI companies or taken by AI companies to train their models, and using it as a point of political leverage. And I think, we can talk a lot about kind of overarching regulations. We can talk about a lot of different ways to operationalize a lot of what Aida is talking about. But I think focusing on policies that are really strictly about enforcing and giving people way more bite and way more leverage is a better way forward than, say, installing some bigger principles on these overarching frameworks and things like that. So I think those are the kind of solutions that will actually put rubber to the road. And I think Ziad would probably know way more about this, of the actual technical feasibility of that, than I do, which would be a fun conversation to have. But to your point, or to your question, which I think was about how this affects, the kind of human autonomy question. I think what we need to start looking at is not just how the AIs we train and the AIs that are kind of slowly replacing us from this. I mean, we've talked a lot about these kind of spatial metaphors of control and humans in the loop and things of this nature, or AI complementing work versus replacing us. I think we've seen already that it's already integrated into just so many different daily tasks. It might be someone writing a speech for a presentation. It might be a political actor. I mean, there's a good list kept by the name's escaping me now, but the guys who behind Gradual Disempowerment, which I'm pretty sure is just at like gradualdisempowerment.org. Jan Kovic. A good list of ways that we're already kind of seeding over these small amounts of, I don't want to use the word control, small amounts of just influence, persuasion, that allow us, that stop us from being able to even see what it is we're giving up. And I think one of the concrete things we can do is to fund more research. Big surprise, academic wants more research funding. But I mean, fund more research on precisely that, about what are those mechanisms of, when do people notice when they're kind of getting led down a garden path by an AI? When do people start to care that little jobs in their life are getting replaced by an AI? Like, I know we want a robot that does the dishes. I know we want a robot that does the laundry and all of those things, but we're also very willing to cede other stuff that we do seem to care about. And I think a lot more research on those kinds of capture that kind of capture is incredibly important. I hope that answered your question. But I would love to know actually Aida's opinion on the data union thing, because I'm sure she would know a lot more about it than I do.
Pierre, would you like to react to what Aida and Jacob have just said? I saw you also have a reaction in the chat. You're muted. We cannot hear you, Pierre. You're muted.
AI is artificial intelligence because it captures human knowledge, not only explicit knowledge, but also tacit knowledge. So it is the very nature of AI to do this. And the purpose of this panel is to think about a world transformed by AI. And for me, the main point is that AI is becoming the interface between individuals and the collective intelligence. And it's not only that we, as individuals, benefit from the collective intelligence, it is also that everything that we do, not only by interacting with chatbots, but also by living online, we are feeding, we are training AIs. So it is a loop. And I think that we have to think about this in this broad information ecosystem. That's my message. And we should also rethink education in this perspective.
Thank you, Pierre. Senai, would you like to chip in on that, and also on Jacob's point that we need a lot of more research to understand this impact of AI?
Yes, I think research is needed, but I think engagement is much more important. Engagement of the young, already at the elementary schools. We are entering a new world, and my son is studying AI now, and he's engaging with AI in a completely different way compared to when I studied AI. And it's also a generation that is asking to be liberated in some ways, because the educational system has become an industry. It has become a system that converges the thinking of the new generation, while we need divergent thinking now. So yes, research is important, but I think engaging the public in ways that we also can learn from the public, from citizens, is much more important now than, well, as Paulo Freire would say, banking education that we're pushing our students to, right? And that's also why you see in Africa and Global South, different ways of engaging with AI, different ways of governing AI, bottom-up governance, grassroots AI. I think that's much more important. And I think research, if at all, needs to focus much more on that than, the typical machine learning, deep learning kind of education that we now force our young generation to go through.
Ziad, just a quick reaction to that. What are bottom-up approaches to governing AI in an open ecosystem? For instance, should civil society organization be empowered to audit AI technologies, and how can they do that in a meaningful way?
Short answer, as we're close to time, absolutely yes. They can, they do, and they need more funding for it. On the question of the research point that Jacob mentioned, I think it's absolutely true. We need more funding into research. We're also acutely aware that research timelines are much longer than some of the net effects of the technological advances that we're seeing deployed with AI, but not only with AI. So we need to account for that. And sometimes often civil society actors can move much quicker. What I tend to see in the kind of grassroots bottom-up approach is a lack of resources, which is, as I mentioned before, is also conditions for very wonderful forms of innovation. And so we do see that, but I'd like to see that scale both horizontally and vertically. And that does require a sense of kind of sustainability and resources beyond kind of the initial seed. Where I would like to see, and this is a huge focus for our work, is to convince government actors, large philanthropies, private sector actors to deploy funds the same way venture capitalists do, with kind of wanton kind of risk taking into this field, into grassroots and civil society actors to demonstrate how new approaches can change markets at a much earlier stage, because that is actually what we should be doing. We tolerate a huge amount of risk in the corporate sector, especially through venture capital work, right? But for some reason, we're unable to take those risks with grassroots approaches, with communities that are looking to try out things and may fail, but nevertheless need those resources to do so. And so that's part of the work that I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around and trying to push for, but is how I see what makes a successful grassroots approach work, and also move beyond that to sustainability, to demonstrate, to then move to sustainability.
Thank you, Ziad, and thank you to all the speakers. That's all we got time for today. It was indeed a very insightful and timely conversation, and I hope we will have opportunity to continue it in other discussions and in other occasions.